Ma'am, are you aware that you've been paying a debt that no longer exists? The voice on the phone was calm, almost polite, the kind of voice that didn't belong to a sentence like that. And for a moment I thought I had misheard him, that perhaps the line had cut out or my hearing had failed me the way my eyesight had started to in recent years. But I hadn't misheard anything. I knew that even before I asked him to repeat himself, because something inside my chest had already tightened, a quiet instinct I had learned not to ignore after 68 years of life. I'm sorry, I said, gripping the edge of my kitchen counter as I looked down at the stack of envelopes I had just sorted, each one carefully opened, each bill marked and paid like I had done every single month since my husband passed. What did you say? There was a brief pause on the other end, papers shifting, the soft click of a keyboard. According to our records, Mrs. Collins, the account you've been making payments toward was closed approximately 18 months ago. I felt my fingers go numb, the phone suddenly heavier against my ear. That's not possible, I said quietly, not because I believed he was wrong, but because the alternative didn't make sense, and when something doesn't make sense, your mind reaches for the safest explanation first. I've been paying $500 every month, I added, almost as if saying it out loud would make it real again, would anchor it back into something solid, something understandable. Yes, ma'am, he replied, his tone still steady, still professional. We can see the transactions, but the original loan tied to your late husband's account was settled in full over a year ago. Settled? The word echoed in my mind in a way that didn't feel right, like it belonged to someone else's story, not mine, because I remembered the night my husband sat across from me at this very table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, explaining that he had made some financial decisions he hadn't told me about, that there were debts, that things might be tight for a while, and I remembered nodding because that's what you do when you've been married for 42 years. You don't ask questions that might make things harder. You don't dig into numbers when the man you've built your life with looks at you with that kind of quiet worry in his eyes. You just say, "We'll handle it." And you mean it, every word, even after he was gone, even after the house felt too large and too quiet, even after the nights stretched longer than they should. I kept my promise. I paid what needed to be paid. I cut back on groceries. I wore the same winter coat for 3 seasons. I skipped doctor appointments that didn't feel urgent because $500 every month was what stood between me and the belief that I was honoring what he left behind. And now this man on the phone was telling me that none of it had been necessary. Are you sure? I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how uncertain, because I had always prided myself on being steady, on being the kind of woman who didn't fall apart over confusion. Yes, ma'am, he said again, softer this time. I'm looking at the file right now. I turned slightly, my eyes landing on the small framed photograph on the counter, my husband smiling in that way he always did, as if he knew something I didn't, and for the first time since he passed, I felt something shift, not grief, not exactly, but something colder, something sharper, because if the debt had been settled, if the account had been closed, then where had my money been going month after month, check after check, sacrifice after sacrifice? Can you tell me where the payments were sent? I asked, and this time my voice didn't tremble, this time it came out steady, controlled, the way it used to when I handled problems at work, when people depended on me to figure things out. There was another pause, longer this time, and I could almost picture him scrolling through the screen, deciding what he could say and what he couldn't. I can see the routing details, he said carefully, but I would recommend you come into the branch so we can go over everything in person. In person, I repeated silently, because suddenly this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just a misunderstanding buried in paperwork. This was something else. Something that had been happening quietly, consistently, right under my nose. All right, I said, straightening slightly, my grip on the counter loosening just enough for me to stand without feeling like I might fall. I'll come in tomorrow. I hung up the phone and stood there for a long moment, the kitchen clock ticking steadily on the wall, the same clock that had measured out every ordinary day of my life, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. I looked again at the stack of bills, at the careful notes I had written in the margins, at the neat records I had kept, as if order alone could protect me from chaos, and for the first time I allowed myself to think a question I hadn't dared to form before. Not when my husband was alive, not even after he was gone. What if the debt was never the real story at all? What if something else had been hidden from me this entire time? Something I was only now beginning to see. I did not sleep that night, not really. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the faint glow of the streetlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room that felt unfamiliar somehow, as if the house itself had shifted in a way I could not quite explain. And every time I closed my eyes I saw the same thing, the stack of checks, the careful handwriting, the numbers that had once felt like responsibility, and now felt like something else entirely, something heavier. Something I could no longer name. By the time the sun began to rise I was already in the kitchen, the coffee maker humming softly as it brewed a pot I knew I would barely drink. I moved through the motions out of habit, pouring the coffee, adding a little cream, setting the mug down beside the same photograph I had looked at the night before. My husband's smile frozen in time, steady and reassuring, the kind of smile that used to make everything feel manageable. I had trusted that smile. I had trusted the life we built together. And even after he was gone I had trusted the version of him that lived on in my memory, the version that would never have left me unprepared, never have put me in a position where I had to struggle alone. That belief had carried me through the past 2 years, through the cold winters and the quiet mornings, through every bill I paid without question, because questioning it would have meant questioning him, and I was not ready to do that, not then. But now the question would not stay buried. It kept rising, steady and insistent, like something that had been waiting patiently for its moment. I picked up the folder I had kept all my financial records in, the one labeled in neat block letters, monthly expenses, and set it on the table, opening it slowly, as if I expected something inside to jump out at me, but of course it did not. It was just paper, numbers, dates, everything exactly as it had been the day before. And yet nothing felt the same. I flipped through the pages one by one, each check recorded, each payment accounted for, $500 every single month, never late, never missed. I had been proud of that in a quiet way, proud that I had managed to keep things together, that I had not let everything fall apart after he was gone. But now that same consistency felt like a pattern I had never questioned, a routine I had followed without looking too closely at where it led. I paused on a page from last winter, remembering how cold it had been, how I had turned the thermostat down a few degrees to save money, telling myself it was temporary, that once the debt was paid off things would ease, that I just needed to get through it. I had skipped a doctor appointment that month, nothing serious, just a checkup, but I had told myself it could wait. $500 was $500, and there were priorities. There were always priorities. I closed the folder slowly, my fingers lingering on the cover, and for the first time I allowed myself to think about what those 2 years had really looked like, not just the numbers but the choices, the small sacrifices that had added up quietly, the things I had gone without because I believed I had to, because I believed I was doing the right thing. And if that belief was wrong, if the foundation it was built on was not real, then what did that make everything I had given up? I stood there for a moment, the kitchen silent except for the soft ticking of the clock, and then I moved with a kind of quiet determination I had not felt in a long time. I went to the drawer by the phone and pulled out the envelope where I kept important documents, the ones I did not need often but could not afford to lose. Inside was a copy of the original loan statement, the one my husband had shown me that night. I remembered how I had folded it carefully, how I had placed it here as if that alone would keep everything in order. I unfolded it now, smoothing the paper against the table, my eyes scanning the lines, the account number, the total amount, the terms. Everything looked the same, nothing stood out, nothing explained what the man at the bank had told me, and yet I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my chest, that something in this story did not belong. Something had been altered, redirected, hidden in a way I had not seen before. I reached for my phone again, not to call the bank this time, but to scroll through my messages, through the small exchanges I had with my son over the past 2 years, brief conversations, polite, distant. He had always been busy, work, travel, responsibilities that seemed to grow more important with each passing year. I had not wanted to be a burden, had not wanted to add to whatever he was dealing with, so I kept things simple, kept things light. I did not mention the bills, did not mention the strain, because that was my responsibility, not his. At least that is what I had told myself. I paused on a message from 6 months ago, a simple one. "Hope you are doing okay, Mom. Let me know if you need anything," I had replied. "I am fine, sweetheart. Everything is under control." I stared at those words for a long moment. Everything is under control. I had believed that when I wrote it. I had believed that because I needed to, because the alternative was too complicated, too uncertain. But now, standing there in my quiet kitchen with the morning light creeping in and the truth beginning to take shape in ways I could no longer ignore, I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider before. Control is not the same as understanding. And for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer sure that I understood anything at all. The next morning felt colder than it should have for early spring, the kind of chill that settled into your bones and stayed there, no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself in a sweater. I arrived at the bank 10 minutes earlier than my appointment, not because I was eager, but because waiting at home had become unbearable, every minute stretching too long, every thought circling back to the same question that refused to leave me alone. Inside, The bank was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from routine, from people going about their business without realizing that for someone else, something important is about to shift. I gave my name at the front desk and was directed to a small office near the back, the door half open. A man in his 40s stood when I approached, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Collins, I am Daniel Harper, thank you for coming in." I nodded and took the seat across from his desk, placing my folder carefully on my lap as if it could somehow anchor me, as if holding on to something familiar would make what came next easier to understand. He sat down and turned his monitor slightly, not enough for me to see everything, just enough to signal that what we were about to discuss existed somewhere in that glowing screen. "I have reviewed your account history," he began, his tone measured, careful, "and I understand why you are concerned." Concerned? The word felt too small for what I was feeling. But I let him continue. Because this was not the moment for correction. This was the moment for listening, for seeing, for finally understanding what had been hidden in plain sight. "As I mentioned on the phone, the original loan tied to your husband's account was paid off approximately 18 months ago." He clicked something on his screen and I heard the faint tap of keys. The final payment was processed in full, and the account was officially closed shortly after. I leaned forward slightly, my hands folded together, steady, controlled. "Then why have I been paying $500 every month?" I asked, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me, because inside something was tightening, not panic, not yet, but something sharper, something more focused. He nodded as if he had expected that question, as if he had been preparing for it. "That is where things become unusual," he said, and the word unusual lingered in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. He turned the monitor a little more, just enough for me to see lines of numbers, dates, transactions, everything laid out in a way that looked clean, organized, almost harmless. "Your payments did not stop after the loan was closed," he continued. "They were redirected." "Redirected," I repeated silently, the word settling into place with a quiet, unsettling clarity. "Redirected to where?" I asked, and this time I could feel something beneath my calm, not fear but awareness, the kind that comes just before a truth reveals itself. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough for me to notice, enough for me to understand that whatever he was about to say was not simple, not accidental. "The payments were transferred into a secondary account linked to your profile," he said finally, his voice lower now, more cautious, as if he was stepping carefully through something that could easily break. I frowned slightly, the pieces not yet fitting together. "I do not have another account," I said, "because I would have known, I would have remembered. I was careful with these things, I had always been careful." He nodded again, this time slower. "The account was not originally opened by you," he said, and there it was, the first real crack, the first moment where the ground beneath me shifted in a way that could not be ignored. I felt my fingers tighten slightly against each other, my breathing still even, still controlled, but deeper now, more deliberate. "Then who opened it?" I asked, and for the first time since I walked into that office I felt the question carry weight, real weight, the kind that changes things. He clicked again, bringing up another screen, another set of details, and when he spoke he did not look at me right away. He looked at the screen as if confirming something one last time. "The account was authorized under a joint access request submitted shortly after your husband's passing," he said, and I felt something inside me go still, completely still, like the moment just before a storm breaks. The name listed as the secondary holder is Sophia Collins. The room did not spin, the walls did not close in, there was no dramatic shift in the air. Everything remained exactly as it had been, the same desk, the same chair, the same quiet hum of the building around us. But something inside me changed in a way that was far more permanent. I sat there looking at the screen, at the name that now carried a different meaning than it had just a few moments ago. And I realized with a clarity that felt almost cold that this was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, not something that could be explained away with paperwork or confusion. This was deliberate, structured, sustained over time. And the worst part was not the money, not the numbers or the months or the quiet sacrifices. The worst part was the realization that someone had been close enough to know exactly what I would do, close enough to know that I would never question it, close enough to use that against me. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands now resting calmly in my lap, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel confused, I did not feel uncertain. I felt something else entirely, something steady, something clear. And as I looked at the name on that screen, I understood that whatever came next would not be about understanding anymore. It would be about deciding what to do with the truth I had just been given. I did not react the way most people might expect when they hear something like that. There was no sharp intake of breath, No immediate questions spilling out one after another. Instead I simply nodded, as if Daniel had just confirmed something small, something routine, and for a moment I let the silence sit between us, not because I did not have anything to say, but because I understood that whatever I said next mattered. "Can you show me the transactions?" I asked, my voice even measured, and he seemed to relax slightly, as if this was the response he had hoped for, something calm, something manageable. He turned the monitor fully toward me this time, and I leaned in just enough to see clearly, line after line, month after month, the same amount, $500, leaving my account with quiet consistency, and on the other side, a receiving account that now had a name attached to it, Sophia Collins. The letters looked ordinary, the same as they had always looked when I saw them written on holiday cards or typed in family group messages. But here, in this context, they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. I followed the dates with my eyes, tracing them back through time, last month, the month before, all the way to the point where Daniel had said the original loan was closed. And there it was, no gap, no pause, no indication that anything had changed. The payments had simply continued, redirected without a word, without a question, without my knowledge. Was there any notification sent? I asked, not because I expected there to be, but because I needed to understand how cleanly this had been done, how carefully it had been arranged. Daniel shook his head slightly. "The authorization allowed for automatic transfers without additional alerts," he said, choosing his words with care. "It would not have triggered a standard notification." I sat back slowly, letting that settle, letting the simplicity of it sink in. No alerts, no warnings, nothing to disrupt the routine I had followed so faithfully. It was almost efficient in its quietness, almost elegant, if you looked at it from a certain distance, and that thought alone told me everything I needed to know about the intention behind it. This was not carelessness, this was not confusion, this was planning. I closed my eyes for just a second, not long enough for anyone to notice, just enough to steady the shift happening inside me. And when I opened them again, the room looked the same, but I did not. "How much in total?" I asked, and Daniel glanced back at the screen, calculating quickly. "Approximately $12,000 over the past 2 years. 12,000, the number landed quietly, without drama, but it spread through me in a way that was far more profound than any raised voice could have been. $12,000 that could have covered medical bills, home repairs, small comforts I had denied myself without complaint. $12,000 that I had believed was necessary, justified, honorable even, and now it stood there as something else entirely, something taken, not given. I nodded once more, absorbing it, not rushing, not reacting, because I understood now that reacting would not serve me, not yet. "I would like copies of all of this," I said, gesturing lightly toward the screen. "Every transaction, every authorization document, everything connected to that account." Daniel hesitated again, just briefly, then nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Collins, we can prepare that for you." He stood, stepping out of the office to retrieve the documents, and as the door closed behind him, I was left alone with the quiet hum of the bank and the steady rhythm of my own thoughts. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, the skin thinner than it used to be, the veins more visible, signs of time that I had accepted without resistance, because time is something you learn to live with, something you cannot argue against. But this was different. This was not time, this was choice. Someone had made a choice, repeatedly, deliberately, to take from me while knowing exactly how I would respond, or rather, how I would not respond. I thought about the small moments over the past 2 years, the conversations with Sophia, her polite smiles, her careful tone, the way she would ask, "Are you managing all right?" in that soft, measured voice, and how I would always answer, "I am doing just fine," because I believed that was what she wanted to hear, what everyone wanted to hear. I thought about my son, Ethan, the way he had grown more distant, not unkind, never openly dismissive, just less present, less engaged, as if something had shifted in him that I could not quite reach. And now, sitting there in that quiet office, I began to wonder not just what Sophia had done, but what Ethan knew, because things like this do not happen in isolation. They do not exist in a vacuum. They require awareness, access, opportunity. And those are not things that appear out of nowhere. I straightened slightly in my chair, my back aligning in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, almost new. And in that moment I understood something clearly, something that settled into place. With a quiet certainty, I had spent the past 2 years honoring a promise that no longer existed, sacrificing for a burden that was never mine to carry. And now that I knew the truth, now that I had seen the structure beneath the surface, the rules had changed, not for them. They had been operating under their own rules all along, but for me, because understanding does that, it shifts the ground beneath your feet. It takes what was once unquestioned and turns it into something you can finally see. And once you see it, you cannot go back, you cannot unknow it. Daniel returned a few minutes later with a thick envelope. placing it carefully on the desk in front of me. "Everything you requested," he said. And I nodded, taking it with steady hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the paper but what it represented, and as I stood to leave I did not feel the confusion that had followed me into this building. I did not feel the uncertainty that had kept me awake the night before. What I felt instead was something far more precise, far more controlled. I felt clarity, and with it the quiet beginning of something else entirely. I did not go straight home after leaving the bank. Instead I sat in my car for a long time with the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me, untouched, as if opening it too soon would force everything to become real in a way I was not yet ready to fully face. The parking lot was quiet, a few people coming and going, ordinary lives continuing without interruption, and I found myself watching them with a kind of distant awareness, wondering how many of them believed their lives were exactly what they appeared to be, how many of them trusted the people closest to them without question. I had been one of those people not so long ago. I had believed that if you built your life on honesty and care, if you gave more than you took, then that foundation would hold, that it would protect you from things like this. But sitting there with $12,000 of quiet betrayal resting just inches away, I understood that belief had been something else entirely, not protection but permission. I picked up the envelope slowly, feeling the weight of it in my hands, and finally opened it, sliding the documents out one by one, spreading them across the seat beside me. Each page a record, a confirmation, a detail I could no longer ignore. There were authorization forms with signatures that looked familiar enough to pass without question, routing numbers, transfer confirmations, all of it arranged with a precision that spoke of intention rather than accident. And as I read through them carefully, something began to take shape, not just what had happened, but how the account had been set up within weeks of my husband's passing, the timing so close to that period of grief and adjustment that I would not have been looking closely at anything beyond what was immediately in front of me. It had been done when my attention was elsewhere, when my world had been reduced to simply getting through each day, and that detail alone told me more than any explanation ever could. I paused on one document, my eyes narrowing slightly as I read the date again. The authorization had been processed just 3 days after the funeral. 3 days. I could still remember that week clearly, the constant stream of people, the casseroles left on the counter, the quiet condolences, the exhaustion that settled into my bones, and in the middle of all that, while I was still trying to understand what it meant to be alone after 42 years, someone had been arranging access to my finances, someone had been making decisions that would shape the next 2 years of my life without my knowledge. I leaned back in my seat, the paper resting lightly in my hands, and for the first time since I had seen Sophia's name on that screen, I allowed myself to think about her not as my daughter-in-law, not as the woman who joined our family with polite smiles and careful words, but as someone who had made a choice, a series of choices, each one building on the last, each one requiring a level of awareness that could not be dismissed or misunderstood. I thought about the conversations we had shared over the past 2 years, the way she would sit across from me at the table, her hands folded neatly, her voice always measured, always kind in a way that felt appropriate, never excessive, never revealing too much. I remembered the time she had asked about my finances, not directly, never directly, but through small, careful questions. "Are you managing all right with everything? Or the house must be expensive to maintain on your own?" And I had always answered in the same way, reassuring, minimizing, because that is what I had been taught to do, to keep things simple, to avoid burdening others with my struggles. And now looking back, those questions felt different. They felt calculated, placed with intention, as if she had been measuring something, confirming something, making sure that the pattern continued uninterrupted. I closed my eyes briefly, not in denial, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because this was no longer about discovering something new. It was about seeing what had always been there, just beneath the surface. I gathered the papers carefully, placing them back into the envelope in the same order, not because it mattered, but because order was something I understood, something I could control. And as I set the envelope back on the seat, I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found my son's name, Ethan. My thumb hovered over it for a moment, not because I did not know what to do, but because I understood that this was a line, a quiet line that once crossed could not be undone. For 2 years I had accepted things as they were, I had trusted, I had endured, I had believed that what I was doing was necessary, but now I knew better. Now I understood that what had been taken from me was not just money but choice, and that was something I could not simply overlook. I lowered the phone slowly, not calling him, not yet, because this was not a conversation to be rushed. This was not something to be handled with emotion or impulse. This required something else. Entirely, something more deliberate, more precise. I started the car, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum. And as I pulled out of the parking lot, I felt a calm settle over me, not the kind of calm that comes from resolution, but the kind that comes from clarity, the kind that allows you to move forward without hesitation, because you finally understand where you are standing and, more importantly, who you are standing against. I did not drive home right away, not because I was lost, but because I needed time to think without interruption. The road stretching out in front of me in long, quiet lines, the familiar streets of my town feeling slightly different now, as if I were seeing them from a distance instead of being part of them, and as I drove, I began to notice things I had not paid attention to before, small details, the way people moved, the way they interacted, the quiet exchanges that seemed simple on the surface but carried meaning underneath, and it occurred to me that I had been moving through my own life in much the same way, seeing what was presented, accepting it without question, never looking too closely at what might be hidden just beneath. That realization did not bring anger the way I might have expected. It brought something else, something steadier, something that felt almost like resolve. By the time I reached my house, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting light across the front porch, the same porch where I had once sat with my husband in the evenings, talking about ordinary things, plans for the weekend, small repairs that needed to be done, nothing complicated, nothing deceptive. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel before finally stepping out and walking toward the door. Inside, the house was exactly as I had left it, quiet, orderly, everything in its place, and for the first time since this began, I felt something shift in the way I moved through it, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but awareness, as if every object, every room, every corner held a memory that now needed to be examined more carefully. I placed the envelope on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment, looking at it, not with dread, but with purpose. Then I turned and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one I used for paperwork, bills, anything that required attention. I pulled out a chair and sat down, opening the drawer where I kept my checkbook, my statements, everything that documented the routine I had followed so faithfully, and I began to go through them again, not as someone trying to manage expenses, but as someone trying to understand a pattern. I laid out the bank statements side by side, month after month, tracing the path of each payment, noting the consistency, the precision, the absence of any deviation. And as I did, something became clear. This had not just been planned once, it had been maintained, adjusted, ensured over and over again, and that required more than opportunity, it required access, continued access. I reached for my phone again, this time not to call, but to look, to search for something specific. I opened the messages between me and Ethan, scrolling slowly, reading each one more carefully than I had before, and I noticed things that had once seemed insignificant, small mentions of paperwork, casual references to helping with some financial details after his father passed, moments where he had asked for information, account numbers, details I had provided without hesitation because he was my son, because helping him felt natural, expected, and now those moments aligned in a way that was impossible to ignore. I set the phone down gently, not with frustration, not with anger, but with recognition, because this was no longer about suspicion, it was about confirmation. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard, the same yard I had maintained for years, trimming, planting, keeping everything in order, and I thought about how much effort it takes to maintain something over time, how consistency requires intention, attention, care, and the same was true here. What had been done to me had not been accidental. It had been maintained with the same kind of steady effort I had given to everything else in my life. That thought settled into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. I turned back toward the table, my eyes resting on the envelope once more, and then I made a decision, not a loud one, not something dramatic. Just a simple, quiet choice. I would not confront them yet. I would not call Ethan. I would not question Sophia, because questions give people time to prepare answers, and I was no longer interested in answers. I was interested in truth, in facts, in evidence that could not be explained away or softened with careful words. I returned to the desk and reached for a notepad, writing down a list, not of accusations but of actions. The bank had provided the records, but there were other steps to take, legal steps, protective steps, things I had never needed to consider before but now understood were necessary. I wrote down the name of an attorney I had heard mentioned by a neighbor, someone who specialized in financial matters, someone who would understand what I did not yet fully know how to navigate. I wrote down the need to secure my accounts, to review access permissions, to ensure that what had been taken could not continue to be taken. Each line I wrote felt steady, deliberate, not rushed, not emotional, and as I finished, I looked at the list for a moment, then set the pen down carefully beside it. The house remained quiet. the same as it had been that morning, but I was not the same. Something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not because of what had been taken, but because of what I now understood. And as I gathered the papers and placed them neatly back into the envelope, I realized that for the first time in 2 years, I was no longer reacting to what had been left behind. I was preparing for what came next. I called the attorney the next morning just after 9 o'clock, not because I felt ready, but because waiting any longer would have meant giving myself time to hesitate, and hesitation was something I could no longer afford. The woman who answered the phone spoke with a calm efficiency that reminded me of the bank, but there was something different in her tone, something more direct, less cautious, as if she was used to hearing stories that did not quite add up on the surface. Law offices of Carter and Blake, she said, and I introduced myself simply, explaining that I needed to review some financial matters related to my late husband's accounts. I did not say anything about Sophia, not yet, not because I was protecting her, but because I was protecting the facts, and facts needed to be clear, unshaped by emotion or assumption. I was given an appointment for that same afternoon, and when I hung up, I felt the same steady calm I had felt the day before. Not relief, not comfort, but something firm, something that allowed me to move forward without second-guessing each step. The office was located downtown in a building I had passed many times but never entered. The kind of place you only go when something requires more than ordinary solutions. The waiting room was quiet, a few chairs, a small table with neatly arranged magazines, everything in order, everything controlled. I gave my name at the desk and was asked to wait. And as I sat there, I noticed how different this felt from the bank, not because the situation had changed, but because I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I was preparing to respond to it. Mrs. Collins? A voice called, and I stood, following a woman in her 50s down a short hallway into a private office. I am Laura Carter, she said, offering her hand, her grip firm, her expression attentive without being overly sympathetic. And I appreciated that. I did not need sympathy, I needed clarity. I took a seat across from her desk and placed the envelope in front of me, sliding it toward her without ceremony. I would like you to look at these, I said, and she opened it carefully, reviewing the documents one by one, her eyes moving quickly but thoroughly, the kind of reading that comes from experience, from having seen patterns like this before. And as she read, I remained quiet, watching, waiting, because this was the moment where what I suspected would either be confirmed or corrected. And I was prepared for either outcome. After several minutes, she set the papers down neatly, aligning them with a precision that mirrored my own habits, and looked at me directly. Mrs. Collins, did you authorize any of these transfers? She asked, and I shook my head. No, I said, my voice steady, and she nodded slightly, as if that was the answer she expected. And you were not informed that the original debt had been paid off? She continued, and again I shook my head. No, I repeated. And this time there was no hesitation at all, just certainty. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression thoughtful, not surprised, not alarmed, just focused. Then what you have here is not simply a misunderstanding, she said, her tone clear, precise. This is unauthorized financial redirection, potentially rising to the level of fraud. The word did not shock me the way it might have the day before. It settled into place with the same quiet weight as everything else I had learned. Not because it was less serious, but because I had already begun to understand its shape, its implications. What does that mean for me? I asked, and she folded her hands lightly on the desk. It means that you have options, she said. Legal options, protective measures, and the ability to recover what was taken depending on how you choose to proceed. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, not rushing to respond, because this was not a decision to be made quickly. This was something that required the same care that had been used against me, but in a different direction, a direction I now controlled. What would you recommend? I asked, and she studied me for a moment, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that suggested she was assessing not just the situation, but me, my readiness, my understanding. I would recommend that you do not confront the individuals involved yet, she said, her voice steady. At least not until we have secured all relevant documentation and ensured that your accounts are protected moving forward. I felt a small shift inside me at those words. Not resistance but recognition. Because that aligned with what I had already decided. I agree, I said, and she nodded once more. Good, she replied. Then we will proceed carefully. She reached for a notepad, writing down a list of steps, many of which mirrored the ones I had written the day before: secure accounts, document transfers, establish a clear timeline. And as she spoke, I realized something that had not been fully clear until that moment. I was no longer alone in this. Not in the way I had been before, not in the way I had felt after my husband passed. This was no longer something I was carrying quietly on my own. This was something structured, something that could be addressed with precision, with intention, with the same level of care that had been used to create it. And as I sat there in that office listening to her outline the next steps, I felt the final piece settle into place, not the anger I might have expected, not the hurt that had defined the past 2 years, but something far more steady, far more controlled. I felt ready, not to react, not to confront, but to act in a way that would ensure that what had been done to me would not simply be acknowledged, but answered in a way that could not be undone. The following days unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely natural, as if I had stepped into a version of myself I had not needed before, one that observed more than it spoke, one that listened more than it revealed. I followed every instruction Laura had given me methodically, without hesitation. I contacted the bank again, this time not as someone asking questions, but as someone making requests, firm ones. I updated my account access, removed any secondary permissions, placed additional verification steps on every transaction, each action small on its own but together forming a boundary that had not existed before. And as I did, I noticed something subtle, something I might have missed if I had not been paying attention. The process was not difficult, it was not complicated, it was simply something I had never thought to do, because I had never believed I needed to. That realization settled quietly, not as regret, but as understanding. I kept my routine unchanged on the surface. I still paid my bills, still went to the grocery store on Wednesdays, still called my sister on Sunday evenings. Nothing outward shifted, and that was intentional because, as Laura had said, clarity requires patience and patience requires stillness. A few days later Ethan called, his voice carrying the same familiar warmth it always had. "Hey Mom, just checking in, how are you doing?" he asked, and I answered the way I always did. "I am doing just fine." My tone calm, even nothing to suggest that anything had changed, and in that moment I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. He was not asking because he did not. No, he was asking because it was expected, because it maintained the pattern, and I allowed it, not because I was unaware, but because I was no longer reacting. I was observing. Sophia came by later that week, stopping in with a small container of soup, something homemade, something thoughtful on the surface. "I made extra and thought you might like some," she said with that same careful smile, the one I had seen so many times before. And I thanked her, inviting her in, watching the way she moved through my kitchen as if everything was exactly as it should be, her eyes scanning briefly, not in suspicion but in familiarity, as if confirming that nothing had changed. We sat at the table, the same table where so many ordinary conversations had taken place, and she asked me the same question she always did. "Are you managing all right? Do you need anything?" And I answered in the same steady way. "Everything is under control." And for the first time those words were true, not in the way they had been before, not as a reassurance built on assumption, but as a statement grounded in awareness. I watched her carefully, not with hostility, not with accusation, but with clarity, noticing the small things, the way she avoided certain topics, the way her tone shifted ever so slightly when finances were mentioned, the way she maintained a balance between concern and distance. And it became clear that she was not uncertain. She was comfortable in the belief that the structure she had created was still intact, that the pattern remained undisturbed, and that understanding gave me something I had not expected, not satisfaction, not yet, but position. I knew something she did not know I knew, and that shifted everything. After she left, I did not rush to act, I did not confront, I did not call Ethan. Instead I returned to my desk, reviewing the documents Laura had helped me organize, each piece of evidence now clearly labeled, clearly connected, forming a timeline that no longer felt confusing or fragmented, but complete. I noted the dates again, the consistency, the lack of interruption, and I saw it not just as a record of what had been taken, but as a record of what had been assumed about me, about my behavior, about my silence. And in that realization something settled firmly into place. This was not just about money, it was about perception, about how I had been seen, how I had been understood, and how that understanding had been used. I closed the folder slowly, my hand resting on it for a moment longer than necessary, and then I stood, walking through the house with a steady pace, the same rooms, the same furniture, the same quiet, but none of it felt the same, not because anything had changed physically, but because I was no longer moving through this space as someone carrying a burden left behind. I was moving through it as someone who had uncovered something hidden, something deliberate, and who now had the ability to decide what to do with that knowledge. The next step would come soon. I knew that, not because I felt urgency, but because I felt readiness, and readiness does not rush. it waits until everything is in place, until every piece aligns, until the moment is no longer uncertain, but inevitable. The invitation was simple, nothing unusual, just a quiet message sent 2 days in advance. Dinner at my place on Sunday, I would love for you both to come. And Ethan replied almost immediately, warm as always, of course Mom, we will be there. Sophia followed with a brief confirmation, polite, predictable, and I read their responses without emotion, not because I did not care, but because I understood now that what mattered was not what they said, but what they had done. Sunday evening arrived without ceremony. I prepared the table the same way I always had, the same dishes, the same arrangement, nothing out of place, nothing to suggest that anything about this evening would be different from all the others that had come before it. And that was intentional, because consistency creates comfort, and comfort lowers attention. They arrived on time, Ethan carrying a bottle of wine, Sophia stepping in with that same composed smile. It smells wonderful in here, she said, glancing around the room with a familiarity that no longer felt neutral. I greeted them calmly, taking the wine, thanking them, moving through the motions with a steadiness that came not from habit, but from clarity. We sat down together, the three of us, plates filled, conversation beginning in the usual way, light, ordinary, Ethan talking about work, Sophia adding small details, the rhythm of it all so familiar that it might have felt comforting once, but now it simply felt observed, like watching something unfold from a distance. I listened, nodded, responded when necessary, allowing the conversation to move naturally, not rushing, not interrupting, because timing matters, and I had waited this long without knowing. I could wait a little longer now that I did. Halfway through the meal, I set my fork down gently and reached beside me for the folder I had placed there earlier, the same one I had carried from the bank, the same one I had reviewed with Laura, and I placed it on the table. Between us, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the space slightly, Ethan's voice trailed off mid-sentence, his eyes moving to the folder, then to me, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Sophia's posture changed almost imperceptibly, her shoulders tightening just a fraction, her attention sharpening, and in that moment, I saw it clearly, not the guilt, not yet, but the awareness, the recognition that something had shifted. I went to the bank this week, I said, my voice calm, even the same tone I had used all evening, and I watched them both carefully. Ethan frowned slightly, leaning forward. Is everything okay? He asked, concern present, but measured. Sophia remained still, her expression composed. Waiting, I opened the folder slowly, taking out a few of the documents and placing them neatly on the table, turning them so they faced them, not pushing, not forcing, just presenting. The loan your father left behind? I continued. It was paid off 18 months ago. The words settled into the space between us, quiet, precise, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's eyes moved quickly over the papers, confusion deepening. That does not make sense, he said, his voice uncertain. No, and I nodded slightly. No, I agreed, it does not. Sophia's gaze shifted to the documents, then back to me, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation behind it, the quick assessment, the silent adjustment. There must be some kind of mistake, she said, her voice controlled, almost gentle, and I met her gaze without hesitation. There is no mistake, I replied, and I reached for another document, sliding it forward. The payments continued, every month $500 redirected into a secondary account. I paused, just long enough for the next words to settle with full clarity. An account under your name. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not empty, it was full of everything that had been unspoken for 2 years. Ethan looked up sharply, his eyes moving between me and Sophia, the confusion now mixed with something else, something closer to realization. Sophia? He said, her name coming out slower than before, and she did not respond immediately, just for a second, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. I did not raise my voice, I did not press further. I simply placed the final document on the table, the one that connected everything clearly, the dates, the transfers, the authorization, all of it laid out without interpretation, without accusation, because it did not need either. The truth does not require explanation when it is complete. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and I looked at them both with a steadiness I had not felt in a long time, not as a mother seeking answers, not as someone asking for understanding, but as someone who had already found both. I was not paying his debt, I said quietly, my voice firm, unwavering. I was funding something else entirely, and as the weight of that settled over the table, I realized that the moment I had been preparing for was not about confrontation, it was about clarity, and now that clarity was no longer mine alone.